Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are Climate Convergence here in Metro Vancouver, joined by featured speakers and guests for an important discussion about the US military's role and the military's role in destroying the climate. I'm just going to give a few more minutes for people who are logging in to join. But we are looking forward to today's webinar and to the subsequent discussion about what is most important and vital to our world today, which is how to end climate crisis, wars, and to bring about the better world we all know is possible and absolutely necessary. Okay, so hello again, everyone. This is the webinar, Climate Justice Organizing in the Time of COVID-19, War, Militarization, and the Climate Crisis, organized today by Climate Convergence, a grassroots climate justice organization in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. We are here today because the US military is the world's biggest climate destroyer, emitting billions of tons of greenhouse gases while waging wars that have a devastating impact on human lives and the environment. We want to start, continue, and bring this important discussion into the climate justice movement in a bigger way than ever before, given the urgency of the climate crisis that we face all around us. Before we begin, I must recognize that the event is hosted from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And in order to give an opening to our discussion here tonight, we will have a greeting from Coast Salish Elder Kelly White. But before we get there, I wanted to introduce who will be on our panel here today. Joining us here today, all the way from Hawaii, we have KAWENA KAPAHUA, who is a Native Hawaiian activist based in Hawaii, working to protect Hawaiian land and human rights on Maunakea, as well as in a plethora of other Hawaiian issues. He is here today and is joining us also to talk about Rimpac, which are the world's biggest military exercises held in the waters and lands of Hawaii that many of us don't even know are happening at this very moment, including the presence of troops and forces from Canada. Then we will have Tamara Lorenz, who's joining us from the Basili School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she is a PhD candidate and also a board member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. Then we will talk some about local issues that we are struggling against here in Vancouver, with an update on the TMX pipeline from Climate Convergence organizer Thomas Davies. Without further ado, I would like to start the video and opening by Coast Salish Elder Kelly White, who is also a teacher, a broadcaster, and a longtime social justice activist. Just 1 second, please. Yeah.
Highest of the honors, respects of tribute to Mother Earth, the land, the air, and the water, the great spirit of the grass grandmothers, blessings of the sacred environment of the earth and the sacred attitude of climate change, and the specific heartfelt unity of all life, the swimmers, the flyers, the walkers, the four-legged and the two-legged, not samat as one, in prayer for the protection of our sacred bundle, the Mother Earth. To one another, not samat. Brothers and sisters, thank the sisters, all the sisters, life of the world, for standing up the world in the highest honor. Sisters, thank the brothers, hold them up with the honor and the strength and the courage of our strength of our ancestors. Hold on to your own heart. Hold on to your family. Hold on to the community. Hold the world. You have the strength. You have the courage and the wisdom to make a difference. You know it. In the highest of the honor, healing our nations of united resistance to war against our sacred Mother Earth. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Stay with us, our guest speakers. You will not be the same heart to heart with the hosts. Thank you for joining us and to stay with us and encourage you to participate in being the change. For the honor of your time, your life, all my relations.
Thank you to Coast Salish Elder Kelly White for opening our webinar and important discussion here today about war, militarization, and the climate crisis. For everyone just joining us right now, before we go into the program, I'll make a few short announcements. The first of which is that this webinar is also being live streamed on Facebook on the Climate Convergence Facebook page. If you would like to share that around to friends and family and supporters, we'll post a link into the chat. As well, there will be a period for discussion following our speakers. Please use the Q&A box in the center of your screen. It says Q&A in order to post any questions that you may have. The chat we will reserve for comments during the program, but questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A. We are here today with speakers from both Canada and Hawaii for a webinar about the devastating impact of war and militarization on the climate, and particularly the necessity of working together with the anti-war movement to fight for humanity and the planet. In the last few days, the US House of Representatives passed a $740 billion Department of Defense budget. This is $2 billion more than last year of a budget that is escalating each and every year. So today we'll hear some about those direct impacts, both on people living and working and organizing in places that experience the full brunt of the US military, as well as hear about the horrendous impact on our planet and on the environment from the military of the United States, but also in the country in which we organize, Canada. The first speaker for today is KAPAHUA. He is here from Hawaii. He is a native Hawaiian activist based in Hawaii, working to protect Hawaiian lands and human rights on Maunakea, as well as in a plethora of other Hawaiian issues. He is a co-organizer of the Cancel Rimpac Coalition in Hawaii that has been working to end the Rimpac war games and is also pushing for the demilitarization of Hawaii in order to further the welfare of the people of Hawaii, its lands and waters. Please go ahead and begin, KAWENA. Thank you.
Aloha mai kako. It's nice to have everyone here. Thank you for having me. Like you said, my name's KAWENA. I'm a co-organizer of the Cancel Rimpac Coalition. And we are a group of community activists, environmentalists, and concerned citizens here in Hawaii, which is an occupied territory of the United States. And basically, we are organizing against the Rimpac War Games, which stand as the largest military exercises on the face of the planet. Rimpac stands for the Rim of the Pacific Exercises. It's hosted by the US military every 2 years. So the last time it was hosted was 2018. It's basically hosted by the US Third Fleet and brings together a lot of other navies and air forces from around the world, especially the countries occupying the Pacific Rim. So just to give you a sense of scale in terms of the size of this, the Rimpac War Games bring together about 25,000 personnel from 25 countries, along with last time it was held in 2018, 47 surface ships, 5 submarines, and more than 200 aircraft. I believe, Allison, you guys have the video. Are you guys going to play the video? Okay. Yeah, so you'll see a bit of that in the video. But basically, it's the largest war game held on the face of the planet, and it's hosted by one of the largest climate contributors or climate change contributors worldwide, which is the US military. And it has an extreme environmental impact, especially here in Hawaii, given we host it, and the burden, there's already a lot of climate burden placed upon us here in the Pacific, just due to the nature of climate change in general, with rising tides and those sort of things. But the increased pollution created by militarism in Hawaii, especially through Rimpac, is extreme and very detrimental to our community. Allison, are you showing the video at the beginning still, or?
Sure, we can do that now.
Okay, yeah, I'll go in after everyone has the visual. I'll show all the
Great. Says active speaker view.
In a world without Rimpac, Papa will bear down smiling through the pain of birth, no longer afraid of losing her child to bombs. She will breathe, and we will breathe. Yeah.
In a world without Rimpac, There is breath enough to stand against the torpedoing teeth, the amphibious assaults, underwater explosions, the nuclear bombs and billions of dollars and bullets of peacetime that continue elsewhere. Breath enough to salve these and so many wounds, to sing so loud we drown all submarine sonar.
In a world without war games on our watery blue body, there is no place for hungry egos, no place for triggering weapons into the belly of the rich, vast blue moana, because she will breathe. Free, freely, freedom, chanting, my body is not your playground.
In a world without militarization, words like colonization and occupation become words used in the past tense. What possibilities emerge when we are free? Islands as space for creative growth and true security. The entire Pacific Ocean unafraid to breathe.
In a world without nuclear warfare, Tahitian, Marshallese, Hawaiian, indigenous lives would be celebrated without hierarchy based on dollars and euros, without fear for our smallness or isolation, needing the protection of empire, unfurling a pandemic of radiation, contamination, and sickness. All lives would be created equal.
In a world without deception, no one believes that security is a function of bullets.
In a world without naval sonar, a song returns from the vast assembly of cerulean gods to an altar of coral and island anchored to this blue chorus. From the depths of obscurity, Kanaroa, a tubulous mele from which we all do our living. The source is stable, Ola.
In a world without war, no child will bear a ballistic horizon, only clouds, skies, waves will thunder.
In a world without appropriation, our language will be unstolen. Te mana, te kaha, rest from the crest of Her Majesty New Zealand ships of war.
In a world without naval frigates, Eva traverses the Royal Moana Nui, the Star Command blue sky merging into the navy blue Pacific. Kiwa fishes for islands across the ultramarine, hauling up Hawaii necessary respite.
In a world without war, we wouldn't have to wonder if we'd wake to bombs being dropped on our villages, or question if our hanam was clean enough to drink, our golai safe enough to eat. No trespassing signs and fence lines wouldn't dictate the journeys of our tano and our tasi. We'd be islanders connecting through constellations and canoes, sitting under coconut trees, sharing origin stories, chewing kuha, brown bodies dancing, islander hearts beating, ancestral dreams come true.
In a world without bombs, we honor generations of Ike. We seed forests of koa. We stand in the malu of our sacred mountains, plant our ieve in the frigid waters. We stare back at Aina and see our reflections, kneel down and are fed. In a world without bombs, we rise from the sea they tried to conquer. Ea, mai ke kai mai.
In a world without militancy, silk breaths line a room. Finally, she can breathe.
So this video was put together by the Cancel Rimpac Coalition, like I said. While we're based in Hawaii, we're a union of a lot of indigenous activists from across the Pacific. So we include people from Guam or Guam, Okinawa, and New Zealand as well, or Aotearoa. And so, you know, it's a lot of countries take part in this. And so it's a responsibility across the board, especially here in the Pacific, to do our part to cancel this military exercise and stop the further militarization of our region. So all of the footage you saw was from either taken during the Rimpac War Games or just living every day in Hawaii. During the pandemic, approximately about 6 times a day, you'll have mass military flyovers via helicopters or jets, just given the extent of the military occupation here. Rimpac has a lot of environmental impact just given the land and water it uses for these military exercises. So Rimpac includes things such as practicing for naval invasions or amphibious assaults. So they land on our beaches with their amphibious assault craft and bomb what is considered sacred land. So there are several regions here in Hawaii that are used for live fire bombings, especially during Rimpac. There are Pohakuloa, which is on the Big Island of Hawaii, Makua Valley, and Kaneohe Marine Corps Base. All of these are originally Hawaiian crown lands, which were owned by the Hawaiian people prior to the invasion of the United States and the occupation of our country. And so a lot of these spaces have become very, very damaged due to the bombing especially during Rimpac. They're used for aerial strikes, artillery, regular small arms fire like you saw, and none of these things are cleaned up. Pohakuloa is unfortunately one of the worst victims of this. There's been multiple studies done that show a presence of depleted uranium used in U.S. Tank rounds and other military ammunition that's been left on Pohakuloa and deteriorated and got into the air. In addition to this, at Pohakuloa in 2018, these bombings set off a large brush fire that claimed 2,000 acres of land. And so, again, none of this damage ever cleaned up or healed by the military, just continued to be compounded. In addition to this, they also sink ships during these exercises, which are called the SINK-X trainings. Basically, they take decommissioned ships, which are often stored here in Hawaii, and they just take them out just about 55 miles offshore. So really not very far at all, and they just torpedo and bombard them with missiles until they sink. And the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Navy, the US military, has both publicly stated in their documents that these exercises release toxic chemicals into the marine environment. And given their proximity to shore, it's guaranteed that these toxic pollutants reach our communities through fishing, through beach recreation, or anything like that. And so the environmental impact is extreme here. And Rimpac has a long history of this continued environmental damage. In the 1970s, the U.S. opened up continued bombing against an entire island. One of the islands here, Ko'olave, was used as a military target by the United States and those participants in Rimpac. Ko'olave is a very important island in our culture. It's used by navigators to learn the stars and how to navigate from Hawaii to the South Pacific using nothing but the winds and the sky. And it was continually bombed from about World War II all the way about to 1990, when it was finally given back after, but not without obvious resistance. It was used as a target during Rimpac, and with the Protect Ko'olave Ohana, which is the group that organized resistance against that, succeeded in getting several countries to withdraw from the exercises, such as Japan, Great Britain, and Australia. Unfortunately, countries like Canada were not willing to stop bombing, and so the damage of that island is extreme, to the point that the island no longer houses fresh water. Its water table is broken. It's been blown open due to years of bombing. And so the past couple of decades have been dedicated to trying to rejuvenate the island, get it back to some form of natural balance, which has been great difficulty given the extreme presence of unexploded ordnance and other contaminants on the island. In addition to this, Rimpac not only impacts our human communities here, but also, our natural environment. So it's estimated by the Navy's own estimates that the trainings off the coast of Hawaii and Southern California kill approximately 155 marine mammals every time they do it, and injure roughly 2,000 with, their naval sonar, which is used by their submarines and other naval vessels. And that continues to really harm a lot of our animals. We see beachings, whale beachings, and all these other kind of damage to our environment. And so given that, just the environmental impact of this, the Hawaiian community has worked for years to try and cancel the Rimpac War Games. Unfortunately, to very little success. The military obviously is a very well-funded entity and a very well-entrenched entity. Hawaii stands as one of the most heavily militarized areas in the world, unfortunately. We're basically the gateway to the rest of the Pacific for the United States. So through the occupation of Hawaii, the US military is able to hold Guam, which it owns almost a third of the entire island of Guam, and has continued to displace Chamorros from their native lands, and is expanding live fire training ranges on Guam as well as in Hawaii. And so in addition to just the, not just the environmental impacts, it continues to have a real community cost in terms of displacing Hawaiians and other indigenous Pacific Islanders, which means the land is less taken care of, given that we are the traditional stewards of this land. And given that loss of land, of natural balance, the deterioration of our environment is inevitable. And that compounds year after year after year and continues to get worse. In the year of 2020, we're obviously beset by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so one of the major concerns this year is that these militaries, like I said, 25,000 military personnel from around the world coming to Hawaii will bring the virus with us, or with them, to our islands. Of course, especially the United States currently is in the middle of another COVID-19 spike, which is drastically uncontrolled. Whereas Hawaii, we've been able to somewhat manage it, just due to our isolation and locking down our airports and stuff like that. But the U.S. regime in Hawaii, as well as the military, has stated that military personnel coming into Hawaii on, quote, official business will not be required to quarantine for 14 days like everyone else is, meaning that whoever comes into Hawaii will be able to just walk around the community as normal without any medical safety precautions taken. And so, these offer a really extreme opportunity for the virus to spread in our communities and do extreme damage. Not only that, but the countries that participate in RIMPAC, of which Canada is likely to participate this year, could have the possibility of bringing more of the virus back with them to their communities when the games are over, and necessitating a larger spread of it, especially given the U.S. Would be deploying a great number of their troops to Hawaii. It's also been shown that the United States military has been unable to contain the virus very much during this point. They have far higher rates in our communities. And so the added risk of not only the environmental impacts, but also the medical impacts and the public health concerns are why we're committed to canceling RIMPAC this year. And every year going forward, of course. This year also represents probably the best chance we have or the best chance thus far in the years RIMPAC has been running to cancel it. This year is an electoral year, or an election year in Hawaii, and every single candidate for some of the executive positions in Hawaii has stated that they're in support of canceling RIMPAC this year, given the public health concerns. Of course, but once the pandemic's over, there's still a lot of reasons to cancel it. In addition, the UN has called for a global ceasefire during this time. And so the continuation of preparing for war during this time of global crisis it flies in the face of everything, of any kind of public security or general welfare. One of the really hard parts, one of the really galvanizing parts of RIMPAC is, given this time of COVID-19, a lot of things have been closed here in Hawaii. This includes some of the military bases have been unable to do a lot of the trainings they usually participate in, which means that a lot of the beaches they use for naval invasion practices are closed, even to the military themselves. And so for the first time in probably 50 years, one of the primarily used beaches by the U.S. Marines for naval invasions has become a endangered species nesting ground for turtles, which we have not seen before since the U.S. occupation of Hawaii, just given their heavy use of this area. And so we can see already when militarism is reduced, when militarism is curbed, whether it's by policy or by public health necessity, there's benefits to our environment from it. And so it offers even more reason that we need to be canceling RIMPAC and all war games going forward. Especially this year, they seem to be primarily aimed at military saber rattling against China. A lot of the ships that are going to be participating in RIMPAC are currently forward deployed against Chinese activities in the South China Sea. This includes multiple aircraft carriers and attack submarines, all of which are either based out of Hawaii or out of Guam. And so again, these ships are going to be coming back and participating in these things. And the just increased hostility in our region is extremely detrimental to our communities. Rimpac itself, or just the military's presence in Hawaii in general, makes us a target for enemies of the United States. We act basically as human shields here to America, given its hostility toward China. Any attack on the U.S. mainland has to come through us first. And to the point that in 2017 we were the victims of a false nuclear missile alert. I don't know if everyone has heard about that, but for like 45 minutes, the missile alert system went off, and we were unsure as to whether or not there was a real nuclear missile headed to Hawaii. And it's just an example of how damaging these exercises in extreme militarism are to our community, not our environment included, and just the general welfare of the people here. But I'm going to drop our links to our Facebook and the petition. If you want to help, there is hope, especially for this year, to cancel these things. I've just shared in the chat our Facebook as well as the petition for us to sign. We're at 11,000 signatures thus far and growing. And one of the difficult things about organizing Hawaii is our isolation from the rest of the world. But if you are, one of the things about Rimpac is that there's a lot of countries that take part in this. So if you are from a participating nation, please write a letter to your the government agency responsible for defense or your military, and tell them why they need to cancel Rimpac. Call your representatives, and if you can, also share our work, our Facebook page, with your networks to help us build further solidarity across international lines, in order for us, have a better impact on this world and build a world free of war, militarism, and environmental destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, KAWENA. I think that was a lot of information in a little time that a lot of us didn't really know or could barely imagine such environmental destruction taking place in Hawaii, let alone the struggle of Hawaiian people against the presence of the US military and to demand their self-determination. I think there's a lot that we can support each other with and continue working together. So thank you again for joining us here today. To expand and kind of go from where KAWENA started or ended, I wanted to next invite up Tamara Lorenz. Tamara is a PhD candidate at the Basile School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, the co-founder of East Coast Environmental Law Association, and a board member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. Thank you, Tamara.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be with you all and having this really important discussion on militarism and its climate and environmental impacts. So I'm speaking to you tonight from Waterloo, Ontario. It's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. I have a slideshow that I would like to show you, so I'm just going to get that ready. I hope you can see my slideshow. Okay, great. I've put my email address there. I'm happy to share with you my slides. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the problems of military emissions and military expenditures, and then I'm going to close with some actions that we can take and resources to demilitarize for decarbonization. So I'm going to begin though by talking a little bit about the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, our concern about Canada's Navy participating in Rimpac, and also our opposition to Canadian warships. So the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have also launched a campaign to cancel Rimpac. We had KAWENA and former Colonel Ann Wright on a webinar last month. You should all know that since 1971, the Canadian Navy has been participating in every exercise of Rimpac. And in May of this year, the Department of National Defense made an announcement that Canada is going to participate in Rimpac this year, but just on a scaled down version. So we're going to be sending 2 warships, the HMCS Regina and the HMCS Winnipeg. And in this particular exercise, we are going to be sending our first Cyclone attack helicopter. We're also going to be sending about 450 soldiers. In the past, we sent a lot more materiel and a lot more soldiers. So the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we're totally opposed to the Canadian Navy participating in this destructive naval exercise. We have a website there. You can see vowpeace.org/Cancel Rimpac 2020. We also have some excellent graphics, and we've been sending out tweets that have been targeted to our Prime Minister and to our Minister of Defense. You can follow us on Twitter at handle vowpeace. We too have a special petition. We're sending letters directly to Prime Minister Trudeau and to our Defense Minister Sajjan and to our Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. So I encourage you to go to our website and find the petition and send letters to our ministers to say you don't want the Canadian Navy to participate in Rimpac. I'd also like to tell you about our opposition to warships. In June of 2010, the Harper government announced the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy. This is the largest, most expensive procurement program in Canadian history. So as part of this National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy, we're going to be building 21 surface combatants and armed Arctic offshore patrol vessels at a cost of about $25 billion. Then we have a smaller non-combat package, which is building some research vessels and joint supply ships for $8 billion, and then a non-combat package, which is primarily repair work at $2 billion. In October of 2011, a year later, the federal government announced that the Irving Shipyard in Halifax won the lucrative combat package to build the new surface combatants for the Canadian Navy. And in the past 9 years, the Irving Shipyard has only built 1 armed Arctic offshore patrol. Another one is going to come online this year. But the Irving Shipyard has not yet built Canada's warships yet. So we have time to stop this. Last year, in February, the federal government and Irving made an announcement that Lockheed Martin has been selected to design Canada's new warships. And then a few months later, the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report that showed that the new cost of Canada's warships is going to increase to $70 billion. That's about 3 times the cost of the original contract. So this is a tremendous amount of money. So, I think for a moment that Canada is building, warships to put on our dying, acidifying oceans. Our oceans are in peril. We've got plummeting fish stocks. We have expanding dead zones in the oceans. We should be spending that $70 billion instead on caring and for repairing our oceans and our planet, and in investing in a just recovery from the COVID crisis. So now let me talk a little bit about climate change and militarism. So last June, the Cost of War Project at Brown University released this really excellent report called Pentagon Fuel Use and Climate Change. And it's the first report that tried to calculate the total emissions of the US military. And they determined that the US military annually emits about 59 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is more than 140 countries, including countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. The US military spends about $7 to $16 billion on fuel. One of the things in this report that's important, that was missed in this report, is it's not including the emissions from the construction and destruction of concrete, something that the military does extensively. But I created this chart to show the per capita carbon footprint if you compare the US military with other countries. So for instance, Sweden emits about 50 million metric tons per year. It has a population of 10 million people, so its emissions per capita is about 5 metric tons. Canada, our annual emissions are about 617 million metric tons a year. Our population is 36 million, and so per capita it's 17. The United States, 5 billion metric tons per year is emitted. The population is 324. And the emissions per capita is 16 metric tons. But if you focus on the military specifically, that 59 million metric tons that's identified in this report, but if you look at it on a per capita basis, the size of the US military is about 2 million personnel. Per capita, that's a huge carbon blueprint of 28 metric tons. So that is a massive it's a massive footprint, it's a massive impact. In this report, the Cost of War Project, they list the carbon impacts of various military vehicles. And I just want to have you look at the green arrow there. This is for the F-35 fighter jet. It emits 27 metric tons per flight. The maximum flight is about 1,000 nautical miles. So in one flight, the F-35 emits more emissions than a car emits in a total year. Forbes did a ranking of the hourly cost of various fighter jets, and you can see in the green arrow that the F-35, it costs about $28,000 US to operate per hour. The Canadian equivalent is about 38,000 Canadian dollars per hour. I mentioned this information about the F-35 because the Lockheed Martin F-35 is one of the fighter jets that are part of the bid for to replace the fighter jet fleet for Canada. So last year, the Canadian government opened a competition for new fighter jets. The bids are due at the end of this month. And there are 3 defense contractors that are in the running: Lockheed Martin with its F-35, Boeing with its Super Hornet, and Saab, the Swedish defense contractor, with its Gripen. The Canadian government is going to be making a decision which airplane to pick in 2022, but we have time to stop this procurement. It is the 2nd largest procurement in Canadian history after the warships. So this spring, I have started a campaign to cancel the fighter jets, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this campaign at the end of my presentation. You can see my signs there. No fighter jets, they harm people and the atmosphere. Fund a Green New Deal, not new weapons. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some recent climate and defense policy history. This is, I think, especially important for Canadians. So in December of 2016, the federal government worked with the provinces and the territories to draft Canada's climate policy. It's called the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And it identifies $132 billion that will be spent on renewable technologies, on different green programs over the next 11 years. But 6 months later, the Canadian government released its defense policy called Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And in that policy, The Canadian government is going to be spending $553 billion on the military over the next 20 years to maintain high-end warfighting. And when this defense policy was released in June of 2017, there was no dissent from any politician or any political party. So what's in our defense policy? Well, it's motivated by our defense relationship with the United States and our membership in NATO. We are going to be building more warships than even Harper wanted. We're going to be buying more fighter jets, 88 fighter jets. We're going to be buying new armed drones and attack helicopters. We're going to modernize our submarines and our light armored vehicles, and we're going to increase recruitment. 5 months after the defense policy came out, Canada released the Canadian Department of National Defence released its first defense, energy, and environment strategy. And in that strategy, it says very clearly here on page 9, given the unpredictable changes in operational tempo, the federal reduction target will not include emissions from military activities and operations. So all of these military operations, all of these vehicles like fighter jets and warships, they are exempted from Canada's national greenhouse gas target and our climate policies. Let's review some more information about the climate impacts of the military. So the Canada's Department of National Defence is the largest consumer of petroleum and the largest landholder among all federal agencies. We have 21 bases. And are responsible for about 25,000 hectares. The military, both in the United States and Canada, and this is standard for other NATO militaries, about 75% of the fuel use is for mobile operations to power their vehicles, and 25% is for stationary operations for the installations of bases and facilities. Of all the branches of the military, like the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Special Forces, it's the Air Force that uses the most fuel. Fighter jets use a specialized fuel that's highly toxic called JP8. Military vehicles are very energy inefficient. They have long life cycles with locked-in energy platforms that are really difficult to try to modify with a renewable energy platform. Accounting for military emissions is not transparent and it's not complete. Like I said, they're exempted from the reduction target. This subject is what I'm focusing my PhD on, and I'm filing a lot of access to information requests. So I'll just show you this one slide. It shows you the composition of the fuel use by the Canadian Navy, and you can see predominantly it's using aviation fuel, then there's diesel fuel, gasoline, and ship fuel. In 2011, the Canadian military spent about $600 million on fuel. Now, some of you might have heard that there's a greening government initiative. The federal government is trying to reduce the carbon emissions from its various departments. And you might have seen this slide, and it shows that the Department of National Defense emits, is the highest emitter among all federal departments. But what it's showing for these carbon emissions, they are only looking at the carbon emissions from their bases and from their non-military vehicles, like the fancy cars that they drive the generals around. But if you were to look at total carbon emissions from the Canadian military, it would be much higher, about 3 times higher than that. So it's a tremendous amount of emissions from the Canadian military that, and most of those emissions are being ignored. So I wrote to the Minister of Environment last year, and she sent me a reply and this is a quote, certain sources of greenhouse gas emissions are excluded from the federal reduction target because of their important role in ensuring the national safety and security of all Canadians. This includes the operation of military vehicles and equipment by the Department of National Defense. The National Defense, she confirms, is the largest landholder and the largest energy consumer for the government of Canada. So this is extremely problematic. We are just not going to be able to fully decarbonize if we don't deal with military emissions. And I was at a defense and a climate security conference at the Royal Military College in February. And I asked them if they have any plan to offset military emissions, and they don't. So now let's talk about military expenditures very quickly. There's a misperception in Canada that we don't spend very much in our military. Well, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, their latest report, Trends on Military Expenditures, you can see that Canada is ranked 14th highest in the world for military spending at $22 billion. That's US. You can see, of course, the United States is the top there, spending over $700 billion a year. I looked more closely at the public accounts, comparing military spending in Canada versus spending on environment and climate change. So you can see this table from 2019. Military spending was $31 billion, and the Department of Environment and Climate Change was only $1.9 billion. I've also tracked and compared this spending over time, so over the past 2 decades, and you can see that defense spending in 1997 was about $8 billion. Today, it's $31 billion, and then the Department of Environment has gone from about $500 million 20 years ago to $1.9 billion. This is essentially flatlined. We are not spending nearly enough to deal with the climate crisis, which is the greatest human security challenge that we're all facing, as you know. Now, you might say, well, the provinces pick up or they fill in the gap. Well, I looked at the public accounts for all of the provinces and territories to see how much they're spending on the environment and climate change. And when I calculate that all, it's about $2.4 billion. So if you combine the federal spending on the Department of Environment and Climate Change with the spending from the provinces and territories, it's only about $4.3 billion. It is just simply not enough to deal with the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. Now, what is the Canadian military doing with all of this money that it gets, this huge budget that it has? Again, there's a misperception in Canada that we're a peacekeeping country. Well, we're not. I've been tracking peacekeeping through the UN Peacekeeping Office. They have a ranking. They publish statistics every month, and you can see that Canada is ranked 77th in the world for peacekeeping. We only contribute 35 soldiers to UN peacekeeping operations. This is the lowest it's ever been. Canada isn't doing peacekeeping. What are we doing? We're engaged in war making and in war. Canada was involved in a 12-year combat mission in Afghanistan that totally destabilized the country. Canada led the NATO bombing, for instance, in Libya, again, that destabilized North Africa and led to a humanitarian and refugee crisis. Canada was involved in the bombing of Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2016. Canada right now is leading a NATO battle group in Latvia, and we're training soldiers in Poland, in Ukraine, and in Iraq. So this is what the Canadian military is doing, and all of this activity is extremely carbon intensive, and it's very deadly and destructive. So military emissions and military expenditures are examples of climate injustice. They are highly immoral and they're unethical. You might recall in the Paris Agreement, there are these ethical principles that are identified, like equity, justice, transparency, accountability. Greta Thunberg often mentions these these principles, well, we need to ask ourselves, how is it possible for us to have a just transition when Western countries like the United States, the UK, and Canada are using a disproportionate amount of fuels and emitting a disproportionate amount of carbon emissions for our militaries and for war fighting? How is it possible for us to have equity when our military are going to get a greater share of this remaining carbon budget that we have over the next 30 years, for this war making? So I am convinced that we need to have a parallel process of demilitarization and disarmament alongside climate adaptation and mitigation. I think these are three critical pillars for climate justice: demilitarization, decarbonization, divesting from our extractive, exploitive, capitalist economy, as well as decolonization and working towards a climate justice. These are the pillars that we need for a Green New Deal, a Red Deal, a just recovery. Now, what are some examples, of things that we can do? How can we possibly demilitarize to decarbonize? Well, there are studies that have been done recently on conversions. There was this excellent report done by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade in 2014 called Arms to Renewables, Work for the Future. They looked at converting defense industries in the UK into producing renewable technologies. This report came out last year from the Nuclear Ban Group in the United States, Warheads to Windmills, How to Pay for a Green New Deal. They're both substantive, excellent reports that I encourage you to have a look at. And this study came out from the Institute for Policy Studies a couple of months ago. It's an excellent primer. No War, No Warming, How Militarism Fuels the Climate Crisis and Vice Versa. I've provided the link. It's an excellent report, and they provide some great ways for a conversion at the end of the report. We need to take action. I've identified a few here. I just want to highlight how important it is for us to speak out against NATO. I wrote an article recently about NATO being one of the greatest threats to the climate crisis, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion. The Canadian Voice of Women for Peace a few years ago started a campaign called Demilitarize, Decarbonize, Stop the War, Stop the Warming. Here we are with our banner, and we take that to all of the climate strikes and rallies that we can attend. I'd also like to tell you about a couple of events that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace are having. So tomorrow we're having this excellent webinar with Margaret Kimberley from Black Alliance for Peace and award-winning spoken word artist and peace activist Elle Jones. They're going to be talking about militarism's racism and violence at home and abroad. No to NATO, no to US AFRICOM. And then Friday, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, as part of our Demilitarize, Decarbonize work, we are having a national day of action against Canada buying new fighter jets. So we're calling this Strike for Climate Peace, No New Fighter Jets. We have 18 actions across the country. In British Columbia, for instance, there are actions in Sydney outside of Elizabeth May's office, in Langley, and in Vancouver on Friday from 11 to 12. Outside of the Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan's office, there's going to be a rally. So at all of these places, we're going to be delivering a letter and standing with a picture, no fighter jets, strike for climate peace. We would love for you to participate in any of these actions. And if you can't, we would love for you to stand with a sign and take a selfie and post it on social media and using the hashtag climate peace, no new fighter jets. And you can find out more information on our website. You can see that there, vowpeace.org/no fighter jets. So we'd love for you to help us stop the Canadian government from wasting $19 billion on combat aircraft. And finally, I'd like to invite you to Ottawa next June. We're having a huge peace conference, Divest, Disarm, and Demilitarized, at the beginning of June. And it's also going to include a big protest to shut down CANSEC. CANSEC is the largest arms fair in North America, and it takes place in our capital in Ottawa every spring, and we need to shut it down. All of the big weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Saab are going to be there, and we need to stop it. And so finally, these are some resources that give you more information about some of the things that I've talked about tonight. I'm happy to take your questions and hear your comments. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara Lorenz, for that information, and especially for the part in the end about actions and what we can do. We'll try to get some of that posted into the chat tonight, but we can also, and we'll share the links in a follow-up email following this webinar to everything else that has been shared. It is, you really left me with the strong feeling. I mean, basically why we organize this webinar here today is because we cannot have an end to the climate crisis without ending war and militarism. This is evidenced in all of the climate deals that have been signed that have not included emissions from the military as part of their targets. This is evidenced also, I think, by the way we see the military right now being used against people in the United States protesting for justice, or people, and especially Indigenous people in Canada, who have stood up against resource extraction projects and for their rights. So the war at home and the war abroad is very much linked to the war on our planet, and I think there is a lot that we need to be doing, and we'll talk about more hopefully in discussion. So thank you. To bring things local before we go into the Q&A, Thomas Davies, an organizer with Climate Convergence, is going to share an update on the work happening here, and especially on the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been really awesome to see what other people are doing and how other people are organizing in these challenging times, and to know that there's ways to continue organizing effectively and safely in these times. I wanted to start off, just going to be a quick update on what's going on with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion before we get to discussion. With some good news is that the largest insurer of TMX, Zurich Insurance, just dropped, did not renew its insurance of the TMX pipeline project. That was after a long campaign, and they were following the German insurer Talanx, which also dropped TMX. So it's pretty good. Extinction Rebellion had a protest planned for this Friday in front of their offices in Vancouver, but hopefully that will now be a celebration. We thought it was important to have an update about Trans Mountain because it's a campaign that we focus on a lot, and is something that local campaign that affects a lot of us. The important thing that we need to know is that construction has been ongoing at the Burnaby tank farm, and they've been creating different sites for pipe laydowns, clearing land for man camps, and basically they've put a little bit of pipe in the ground about 50 kilometers outside of Edmonton. So they've been focusing on the infrastructure, but haven't been able to, or have not yet laid a lot of pipe for the project. That being said, we're entering a really important period. It looks like construction is planned to ramp up in August, and that's across the province. So everywhere from Burnaby, where they're focusing on preparing the tunnel, which will be over 4 meters wide and over 3 kilometers long through Burnaby Mountain, and expanding the existing tank farm by 14 tanks. But that also goes through Coquitlam, Surrey, Chilliwack, Hope, Merritt, Clearwater, Blue River, Valemount, and then through Alberta. So right now is a really important time to be paying attention to what's going on with Trans Mountain. As Alison posted in the chat, we're gonna send an email after this webinar with a lot of links about what people have been discussing. So I'm gonna include in that a link to a video from the Wilderness Committee about the ongoing construction and what the progress is. So people can check out what it is. But it's really important to know that like they've been doing everything they can to give the appearance that the project is inevitable. But if there's anything that we know from our last over 10 years of organizing is that this project is not inevitable. And we've seen the priorities of the government and the corporations, and we've seen the costs of this project balloon to 12.6 billion from an estimated 7.2 billion originally. And these are things that in light of what's going on with COVID, where we had the highest unemployment rates ever in Canadian history, focusing money on a pipeline that really doesn't provide actually a lot of long-term employment and has catastrophic climate impacts beyond violating the right to self-determination of Indigenous nations is really a terrible idea. So we're going to continue organizing. There's a lot of groups organizing a lot of actions. In early August, the Wilderness Committee is having visits to see where they're planning on trying to clear trees next to two very important streams. Climate Convergence has a lot of actions planned that are requiring a lot of banners. So if you are interested in some socially distanced painting, we are making that happen. So please send us an email. It's climateconvergence604@gmail.com, but we'll also post that in the email. We need all hands on deck to continue organizing to stop this pipeline. I wanted to kind of emphasize that the last thing is that when we talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline and not being able to will be unable to meet its pretty meager climate commitments if we build the pipeline and continue tar sands expansion. The figures that we're using are not as Tamara pointed out, don't include the military impacts and don't include what the actual impacts of the Canadian government and Canadian military are. So it's even more important that we stop the pipeline because we have even less space than we usually think. I'm going to end with a little bit of good news. I think everybody knows, but I think it's important to highlight because it's been challenging for a lot of us. We're used to organizing a lot of street actions. We're used to being together. And so it's been challenging to watch as governments and corporations completely disregard the safety requirements through their construction of these projects where social distancing is impossible. But I hope everybody got the good news that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has officially been canceled, that the Dakota Access Pipeline was ordered to be drained until further environmental review has been completed, and the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that has stalled the Keystone XL pipeline. So these things are not all inevitable, and something we really want to emphasize with these webinars is that there's people around the world and they're all fighting really hard for the same things when it comes down to it, and we're able to make steps. We haven't obviously stopped all the projects, and we still haven't been able to build exactly the better world that we're all working towards. But there is hope, and we're continuing to find creative and safe and coordinated ways to oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and make links between people around the world fighting for the same thing. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Thomas. When I introduced Thomas, I neglected to mention that Thomas is also an author, and to introduce his book. Thomas is the author of a book called System Change, Not Climate Change, published by Battle of Ideas Press. People can order that by going to the battleofideaspress.com website. We can put information in the chat, but highly recommended and encouraged for people to check out this book. And thank you, Thomas, for bringing that perspective to our discussion here today. If anyone would like to participate in the question and answer and in discussion, Please type your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. If you are listening on Facebook, you can also put your comments in the Facebook chat, and we will be able to address them there. If that is not possible for you, you can send a question to climateconvergence604@gmail.com also, and we will be able to get it there. There's a few already ready to start us off. And I think coming off of what Thomas was saying as well, I think there are many steps forward that we've seen, including during this period of pandemic, this very difficult period for many people around the world, especially poor working and oppressed people who have lost their jobs, have been facing incredible hardships or sickness, which is also very much related to pollution and to health, whether or not the coronavirus has targeted your community. But we've also seen really the potential of people to work together, the potential, and this burden shouldn't fall on poor working and Indigenous communities, but at this time it does, and has really shown us, I think, the seeds of the better world that is possible. And those small steps forward, or those steps forward that we've had, are a lot that we can learn from into our ongoing work. So to start off the questions, there are quite a few over in the box, and I'll address them to really anyone that wants to answer. I think some might have been answered already, but specifically we'll start with the ones around Rimpac, and then we'll maybe go into the broader environmental and climate justice issues. So can we sign a petition to cancel Rimpac? There's been links put in the chat, but maybe we can repost those. And if people could also address whether this matter has been taken to the United Nations, or is there another international forum where people can air their grievance about Rimpac and US military-led war games?
So currently, there's not been international forum engagement for or like against Rimpac. Basically, just due to the nature of the coronavirus at this time. In previous years, it has been brought up for international concern, especially during the bombing of Ko'olave. But since then, it has not as much, simply just because of the American military's push of these exercises as necessary for national security and those kind of purposes. Most of the work in terms of canceling Rimpac has been focused on individual countries in an attempt to get them to withdraw support for the games or participation, just because of the extent of international participation in this. It's easier. It would probably be easier to, or at least from our standpoint, it'd be easier to get individual countries to pull out themselves rather than trying to get the UN or any other international forum involved. There has been Pacific region specific international forums, such as the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Group or the South Pacific Forum. All of these are, the international forums of Pacific Island nations that have come out against these things. Unfortunately, our sway with imperial powers has been minimized due to, the imbalance of power and the role their militaries play in our region. And I just put the petition in the chat again for anyone who wants to sign it.
I'll just re-emphasize that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has another petition. This is directed to Canadian officials, our Prime Minister, our Minister of Defense, and our Minister of Fishery and Oceans, to cancel Canada's participation in Rimpac. I'm not sure if it was answered that Rimpac is one of the questions that was asked about how long Rimpac runs, but if I'm correct, in the past, it was about 3 months long. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of of naval personnel involved. Canada sent thousands of naval personnel. And this year it's scaled down to 2 weeks in August. So it would be really great in the next couple of weeks for people to sign the petitions, to send out tweets about this, and to contact their members of parliament and say you don't want Canada to participate in this. I'm wondering if KAWENA would also mention the social impact of Rimpac as well. And in the past, the problem of sex trafficking. In 2014, when the Canadian Navy was participating in Rimpac and it was stopped in San Diego, there was a huge problem and it got into the media about sexual misconduct by the Canadian Navy, and the Canadian Admiral had to send back the HMC Whitehorse, Canada's warship, back to the country and to get them out of this naval exercise. So there's an environmental impact, and there's also a tremendous social impact, especially on women. And maybe KAWENA could talk more about that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So in 2018, Hawaii has an agency called Hawaii Hawaii Commission on the Status of Women, and so it's a feminist agency in Hawaii focused on the welfare of women. And so they're obviously very concerned with sex trafficking and the exploitation of women in Hawaii. In 2018, they did a major study of sex trafficking in correlation to Rimpac. Every time Rimpac comes to Hawaii, we see a massive dramatic spike in sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, especially by members of the military. That's, of course, unfortunately, of no surprise, given it's very internationally known, the correlation between military presence and militarism and sex trafficking and women exploitation of women. Okinawa, a great example of that, unfortunately. And so, yeah, there's a lot of social impact that these exercises have, beyond just the climate impact. In Hawaii, previous to COVID, we saw about 10 million visitors per year, which was drastic. It's an extreme number. There's only about 1.5 million people living in Hawaii. So on any given day, approximately during the peak season, there's about 30,000 visitors in Hawaii. Rimpac comes to town for about 3 months, as she said, and that brings 25,000 people. So on top of being in the middle of our peak tourism season, 25,000 extra people means it's extremely overcrowded. It means, there's, especially in a time of a pandemic, it's drastically unsafe with the amount of people that there's an influx. It's impossible to control that amount of people. And so, yeah, especially given the exploitation of women in this scenario, we see not only an increase of sex trafficking, we see a wider spread of STIs, sexually transmitted infections, and coupled with a pandemic that would be extremely devastating to our community here. In addition to that, there's other geopolitical consequences to Rimpac. For example, two of the countries that usually take part, Israel, is known for its continued oppression of the people of Palestine. It said it's not participating this year, but it'll probably be back if Rimpac continues to run. And in addition to this, the Indonesian military takes part in these exercises. And the Indonesian military is currently engaged in a war of genocide against the people of West Papua, which is a Pacific Islander community in the region of West Papua, which is occupied by the Indonesian military to the point of continued genocide every day. It's going on right now. And the Indonesian military is trained for these things in Hawaii. We also see continued training for domestic oppression by some of these imperial countries. New Zealand, the New Zealand Defense Force, helpfully, posted a lot of the video from their previous participation in the exercises, and we've seen nations such as the United States and New Zealand and Canada take part in basically what were home raid trainings, so training their military to do home invasions and home raids upon what would like neighborhood homes. They also did exercises in terms of invading smaller Pacific Island nations, like the idea of going in and occupying a nation similar to what they did the NATO and other powers did in Afghanistan and Iraq, just on a smaller scale within a Pacific Island nation. And so the social impacts of this and the training these militaries receive to continue oppression and exploit back home and abroad is vast. And that goes back into, like Tamar said, the exploitation of women and the continued extreme social impact these exercises have, especially here on Hawaii in our community.
Thank you. Yeah, I think really it's the entirety of thinking about there being, 800 to 1,000 US military bases around the world, where each one is an example similar to Hawaii being used to exploit people in the country that they are occupying, being used to support these military games, and also just massively polluting themselves, I think, is something that we have to bring to the forefront of any movement for climate justice. One person asked a question that I think is really relevant to this discussion, which is basically come up in many different cases with, I think, the environmental movement or in our struggle for climate justice, is being told that these things, whether it's military or it's natural resource extraction, is good for the so-called national security of the country that one person may live in. So the argument from people being that it is worth the negative impacts in order to protect so-called national security, whether in the United States or Canada or in countries around the world. So someone is asking really how you can counteract this. How can you explain to people, what are some good points to explain to people that how to counter this idea that threats of attack by so-called foreign enemies justify these military exercises or inflated military defense budgets? Tamara first, go ahead.
Our governments constantly are trying to create and recreate new enemies to justify our militaries and this extremely high military spending. But we don't have enemies. We can't look at countries like Russia or Iran or North Korea or China as enemies. We have to start cooperating with these countries to solve the greatest human security challenges that we're facing, the climate crisis and the poverty crisis. To solve those problems, it requires us working well with other countries. And in so many ways we're doing that. For instance, in the United Nations, Canada cooperates, for instance, with Russia in the International Space Station. Canadian scientists right now are working with Chinese scientists on this COVID health crisis. So we really have to overcome this archaic Cold War thinking that we are enemies with other countries. It's just not the case. I mean, we need to develop friendly relations with other countries. We have to say that there are no enemies. And the people in these other countries, they don't want to be enemies. They want to have a nice life. They want to be friends with us. In the UK, there's been this great initiative that was started up about 4 years ago called Rethinking Security, and they're trying to have a new conversation in that country about demilitarized security. And I would love for us to have a conversation like that in Canada. I'll just let Canadians know on the call that this fall, the Global Affairs Canada or Foreign Affairs Department is planning on having a consultation on a feminist foreign policy. And this would be a perfect time for you to contribute and say, you want friendly relations with other countries. You don't want to have this outdated thinking that's driving our foreign and defense policy, that we have enemies and that we need to prepare for war. We have to overcome that.
I'll echo what Tamara was saying. There's this idea of genuine security, and it's one of those things that when a nation pushes its national security, it's to make its citizens safe. But does anyone really feel safer with massive militarism and military occupation? I mean, I know, especially here in Hawaii, it definitely doesn't make us any safer. If you look at, I guess, one of the most demonized countries, North Korea, that America tends to focus on in terms of saying it's a threat. North Korea, anytime it's threatened the United States, it's threatened somewhere with military bases, such as like Guam. North Korea apparently made threats toward Guam. But primarily that was aimed at the military installations on Guam. Guam itself doesn't pose a risk to the existence of any other country. It's an island of 600,000 people, primarily native inhabitants who have no interest in military conquest or domination. And so, the idea that Guam would be safer by massive expansion of the military-industrial complex on this island. It serves the opposite effect. It doesn't make Guam safer. It makes Guam a target. Same in Hawaii. Almost 26% of our land is owned by the U.S. military, which means that our poverty crisis is exacerbated because no Hawaiians can't afford homes. We're being priced out of our own land, and it gives the Americans more land here. And then in addition to this, you saw, like I mentioned earlier, with the nuclear missile crisis that happened here, or the fake missile crisis that happened here. It's one of those things of, oh my gosh, we're going to die. Like, we have this missile coming, but it was fake. And it, of course, again, with militarism in Hawaii, if you look at such an event as like Pearl Harbor in World War II, it wasn't an attack against Hawaii. It was an attack against the U.S. military installation here. So the only thing that's making us unsafe is actually these military installations and further militarism of our region here in Hawaii, especially. Because other than that, no, we're not a military target unless someone makes us one, due to placing something military strategic on our land. And so in terms of this idea that of demonizing other countries in order to promote national security, it really just destabilizes things more and puts people, especially indigenous, colonized, oppressed peoples, more at risk as being collateral damage in imperial power wars.
Thank you. Kind of coming off of that, there's another question from someone wondering how we can connect the struggle against climate change and militarism with anti-police brutality protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. How is protest being criminalized in Canada and the United States?
It might be good for KAWENA, to start.
Yeah. So one of the things that's come up a lot with the Black Lives Matter movement is the defund the police, abolish the police, demilitarize the police, all of those kind of talking points. And one of the things that really needs to be noted is it's almost impossible for us to demilitarize the police or defund the police without doing the same to the military, because the police gets a lot of its tactics, a lot of their munitions, and a lot of their equipment from the military, especially in the United States. They have the 1033 program, which allows the police forces in the United States to get surplus military equipment for free, no extra charge. And so, of course, a lot of these police departments that we're seeing that end up being complicit in the murder of Black people are hyper militarized and use these surplus military equipment. And there's been multiple studies that show that when these police have these military equipment, it heightens their aggression. It makes them act more of an occupying force than the part of the community and all of these things. So in connecting demilitarization to abolishing the police or defunding the police, there has to be a link between the two, because you can't accomplish handling oppression and occupation at a local level or a local scale with policing if you can't handle it with the military first, because the military especially contributes to a lot of that idea in terms of the hyper aggressive tactics that are used in policing communities, especially those of color, and in terms of just negating the amount of militarized equipment that could end up in police forces' hands. It means stopping it at its source, which is the military.
And can I just add that there's a long history of the use by the Canadian government of the military and the paramilitary forces in this country against Indigenous communities. So this year is the 30th anniversary of the Oka crisis. The conflict over land in Quebec with the Mohawk Indians, and the Canadian government deployed the largest number of military personnel against the Mohawk in 1990. And the RCMP, our paramilitary forces have been used against Indigenous communities across the country, of course, most recently against the Wet'suwet'en people in northern British Columbia as they are trying to block coastal gas the pipeline through their territory. So there's a huge problem with the use of the military against Indigenous community and militarized police as well in Canada. And so not only in the United States, but also in Canada, we need to defund the military and we need to defund the police. And there's actually been some good progress. There's a strong movement in Toronto, for instance, and I heard that there's going to be some reduction to the police budget in Toronto for community needs.
I think the way, another thing that's happened during the pandemic, I think, is that people are more prepared, especially in the United States, to really have lived through and recognized what it means to have the US government not care at all about your life and about your humanity. And I think so many people around the world have already experienced this basic destruction and dismissal of their value as human beings by the US military and their allies like Canada. And I think it has given us an opportunity to really explain to people what it is like to live under the occupation and war of the United States, what it is like to really face the brunt of a war and what it does to your community and your environment. I think it's obviously not the same thing. People living under war with bombs falling from the sky is not the same thing as government neglect during the coronavirus pandemic, but I think it's really opened up that conversation where we can begin to make the question of the impact of the US military on the environment and on people around the world more of a dinner table conversation, something that is more accessible for people to understand. And I think this forum has been a good example of how we can continue to do that. There's been another question about another aspect of militarization, which we haven't touched on a whole lot today, which is the arms trade. So is there, and can you talk about a connection between the arms trade, big oil, and continuing militarization?
Well, so I mentioned in my presentation that the Institute for Policy Studies, a progressive think tank that's based in Washington, DC, a couple of months ago released this excellent report called No Warming, No War, How Militarism Fuels the Climate Crisis and Vice Versa. And they make those links between militarism, the arms trade, and oil. And they also talk as well about border security. It's an excellent report. I want to address Alison, the point that you just made to say that our militarism caused us to be ill prepared for this pandemic. We've been stockpiling in Canada and the United States weapons. We're training for war instead of preparing for a pandemic, which scientists and specialists have been warning about this for many years. And if you think last fall, the United States, which leads NATO, NATO was starting to prepare for the largest war exercise in NATO's history in Europe called Defender 20. So last fall, all of the NATO countries, including Canada, started to move materiel and soldiers to Europe. I mean, thousands and thousands of tanks and fighter jets and warships were all moving into Europe. And in January, this exercise was starting to to starting to take place, but it had to be halted, of course, and in March with the announcement of the lockdown and this health emergency because of the pandemic. So our militarism is making us ill prepared to deal with the global health crisis, the climate crisis. We are as you can see, we're spending so much more on the military instead of caring for people and caring for the planet. We could have instead, for instance, instead of building warships, building affordable housing to deal with the homelessness crisis in our countries that makes our communities even more vulnerable to pandemic. So we're not spending our money in the right places.
Yeah, and here in Canada, I think we have an important tie to make, especially on that point, with the purchase of by the government of Canada of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Canadian people of Canada's taxpayer money is being used directly to the purchase of a pipeline expansion. It's going to cost upwards of $20 billion, and clearly that money could go many other places than building this disastrous project. I think I'd like to focus just a minute as we get towards the end of our questions on some positive aspects or some victories that we've had. I'm wondering, KAWENA, if you could talk some about the work that you do in connection with other countries in the Pacific region. I think that's a really important example, the connections that Cancel Rimpac has made and the ability for you to work together across countries and borders and language barriers and how that's been. And I also know that you were involved in another victory, which was the struggle against the Maunakea telescope that many of us watched and supported from here in Canada. So if there's anything you can share with us just generally about that struggle and why you think of those things, I'll give you a few seconds and just make a special shout out. I want to thank Jerry Condon and Helen Jackard from the Golden Rule Peace Boat for participating and listening to the webinar. The Peace Boat is currently in Hawaii right now, and it's an important project against US wars. Tamara has just posted a link, and I will post also something that Jerry sent out for people to find out more about that project. But KAWENA, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of actually really great, as depressing as this topic can be, there's been a lot of really great successes, especially in the past couple months, especially in relation to Rimpac. One of the things that happened was Rimpac was scaled down from its massive size, it's been in the past years, to a 2-week exercise. They've also attempted to cut it down to an at-sea only event. So essentially what that means is they'd be holding, on land naval invasion exercises as you saw in the video on rifle ranges and bombing ranges. Those will not be taking place this year, thankfully, due to the coronavirus pandemic. All of the exercises will remain at sea. If they even go through with the new spike, we're uncertain if it will. And there's also, a new acceptance of, in terms of the establishment political scene of rejecting this militarism outright, even if it's just for the COVID-19 pandemic and not for the climate crisis and those larger reasons in general. It's important that, even this is a pretty good win. All of the mayoral candidates this year agreed to reject Rimpac. There was a proposal that was put through our legislature calling on the Department of Defense and the governor to cancel the Rimpac exercises, which is probably the first time in at least in the last several iterations of Rimpac that there's been legislature moving on a bill or proposal that is in opposition of further militarism of Hawaii. So these are really great, really great victories that we've had in the past couple months, and hoping to have more, especially as we build up to Rimpac. We're seeing more and more resistance to it, especially here locally. just given the continued harmful effects it's having on our environment already. And one of the things that happens regularly here in Hawaii is live fire exercises. A lot of the military bases and ranges are nearby to residential areas. For example, Schofield Barracks or Schofield military base it's across the street basically from residential homes. And on that base, they do a lot of live fire trainings and bombings, and open burns and helicopter flyovers. And so a lot of the community there, despite the fact that there's a lot of military in it, has been working and organizing against that base, which is a really great success. You know, it's helped this whole, some of the misconduct by the military in our community has helped galvanize people to organize against it and helped open up that conversation of demilitarization, especially given, you know, the deep roots or the deep entrenchment that the military has here. So opening up that conversation is really important. In addition to that, you know, a lot of the international solidarity that's being built in opposition to a lot of the militarism going on is really inspiring and success, and it's helping a lot. Okinawa has been fighting U.S. Marine Corps bases there for a long time. And so that's a lot of the resistance being put up here is inspired by that. And to the point that the U.S. is moving a lot of its military from Okinawa into Guam, which means it's you know, bringing some military out of there, and then Guam is also Guahan is also in the midst of ramping up the resistance to military bases there as well. There's been a lot of protests there in the past couple months in regards to the military expanding live fire training areas in Guam. Which is great, you know, the fact that people are standing up to protect their cultural heritage sites and holding the military accountable. There's also, you know, Guam has also been, or Chamorro activists have also been inspired to help cancel Rimpac in result of the USS Roosevelt catastrophe, which was the major outbreak on the U.S. Aircraft carrier in Guam at the beginning of the pandemic. And so a lot of the solidarity that's being built right now is going to be very influential in helping curb militarism in the Pacific region. And so these are going to have a lot of helpful impacts on the environment and help bring indigenous land stewardship back and indigenous self-determination to the forefront. And then in regards to the TMT or the 30-meter telescope fight, that's a battle that's been going on here for about at least 5 years. Last year, this is just past the 1-year anniversary of the standoff there. Indigenous Hawaiian protectors stood off against state police and National Guard in order to, you know, stop the 30-meter telescope. It was just announced in the past month that the telescope, which has a plethora of environmental issues, indigenous rights issues, and other cultural issues that it would be causing by being built, it's been halted at least for another year. They said they're not going to try construction the year of 2020. They're going to wait till 2021 to try again, which gives us a nice reprieve. And hopefully, you know, they also announced that their cost had increased by $1 billion from 1.4 billion to 2.4 billion. And they were already short of funding beforehand. So this increase in cost is helping push them out of Hawaii and helping to ensure that, you know, our sacred environments are not further damaged.
Great, thank you. So I have one more question, and then I think I'll ask both KAWENA and Tamara to bring some closing comments. And then Thomas, there's been some questions about TMX if you want to just address those as well. But the final question is regarding the use of depleted uranium. That is something that we know is obviously caused incredible environmental destruction, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. But has depleted uranium been used in Hawaii, as far as you know? And do you know anything about the effects of depleted uranium on the people and the environment and the connection to Canada supplying it? I don't know if you would know that, KAWENA. Maybe Tamara does. I do have some information as well, but I'll let you guys go first.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas that Rimpac heavily utilizes is called Pohakuloa. It's basically, it's in the center of the biggest island, Hawaii Island. It's a military training site, unfortunately. It's also a very culturally significant site. It's in the dead center of the island between two of the largest mountains in the Hawaiian Islands. And so it's home to a lot of temples and cultural heritage sites, but it's used regularly for military bombing. One of the things that was done there is in the past 2 decades, the military expanded its Striker Battalion here in Hawaii, which is, it's like an infantry fighting vehicle or tank. And a lot of the weapons testing they did at Pohakuloa utilized depleted uranium rounds, which is meant to, damage enemy vehicles and that such thing. Of course, once used, the U.S. military left it out and did not clean it up, meaning that this depleted uranium was sitting out in open air. And every time they would continue bombing this area, it would kick up that depleted uranium and get it into the air. Pohakuloa is also near several Hawaiian communities, meaning that these communities have increased levels of cancer rates and other health problems. Pohakuloa also occupies a land space directly above the largest aquifer for the island of Hawaii, meaning that a lot of this depleted uranium and other pollutants can go directly into our water. The aquifer in Hawaii is filled by rainwater, so water filters down through our mountains and rocks into this natural aquifer system below the ground, which is directly below Pohakuloa. So any of those pollutants have the possibility of reaching our aquifer and further threatening not only our drinking water, but all fresh water in Hawaii on the island of Hawaii. And so the use of depleted uranium, especially in Hawaii, has devastating health effects, not only immediately through cancer rates, but also in the long term in terms of possibly poisoning our water supply.
On the issue of depleted uranium, just a couple of weeks ago, I filed a couple of access to information on the Canadian military's use of depleted uranium, because we know DU was used by Canada and NATO in the illegal bombing of Serbia in 1999. And very recently, Serbian lawyers and human rights activists have contacted NATO members, demanding accountability and compensation for their use of depleted uranium, because they say that there's, a direct link between an increase in cancer and other health problems of the Serbian community. And of course, we know that Canadian uranium is sent down to the United States. I mean, this year is the 75th anniversary of the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And it was Canadian uranium that was used in that bomb. And I encourage you to look at the Hiroshima Day Coalition.ca for more information about that. And there's an excellent webinar coming up in a couple of weeks that I can put out on the chat. And I also just want to say very quickly that to address the issue of pipelines, if you look at the distribution and direction of Canadian pipelines, most of them go south. So much of Canadian oil is being used to power the US war machine. And I also just want to put in really quickly that I think, along with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, that NATO is one of the greatest threats to the climate and to the environment. I wish we had more time to talk about that, but I just want to say that to you, and I'm going to share an article that I wrote about to explain more about this. NATO puts intense pressure on all of its 30 members, including Canada, to increase military spending to 2% of GDP. Right now, at our very high military spending level, we're at 1.3%. So we simply cannot spend 2% of GDP on the military. And NATO also puts intense pressure on us to constantly modernize and upgrade our military vehicles, warships, fighter jets, etc. So Canada needs to get out of NATO. NATO needs to be abolished if we want to be able to protect people and the planet. So help us with that campaign as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So there's been a few last minute questions, but I think I'll just read them out and then ask people to include them in their wrap up. Thomas, just so you're ready, we'll start with you, and you can address the ones that have been about TMX and any other comments you would like to make. For KAWENA, people are wondering about any progress with cleanup of Superfund sites in Hawaii, or if they've just been false promises from Washington, as well as if there have been any efforts to get the University of Hawaii to divest from TMT projects, which you would have to explain, at least to me. And then Tamara, people would like, again, I think you've addressed this a bit, but if you could emphasize on how people can get involved on the provincial or federal level as part of all of the issues that you've been talking about here tonight. So we'll go ahead and start with Thomas, and then KAWENA, and then Tamara. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly to address some of the TMX related questions. There was one about whether Liberty Insurance has dropped support for TMX. It has not. There's an online action tomorrow. And one of the neat things is Liberty Insurance is based in Boston, and there's a bunch of Massachusetts state legislators who made a video in solidarity with the struggle we have here in British Columbia. There was another question about, is there a plan for a green transition if we don't build TMX? And I guess one of the frustrating things is we have to spend so much effort stopping these projects. But if you look at the amount of creativity and dedication that people have used just to defend life and defend the planet against this pipeline, if we're able to apply that with the kind of government resources and subsidies and backing that TMX specifically, but oil and gas corporations more generally receive in Canada and around the world, I have no doubt that we would be able to do some pretty amazing things to clean up the planet, meet energy needs. And if you look at the Tsleil-Waututh Sacred Trust website, we'll post that again. They made a really good report about the area, about the coastline, the Burrard Inlet, and their knowledge of the ecosystem, of the wildlife, of the diversity, and how to live in harmony with it is amazing. And their assessment of the impact and the devastation that would be caused by the pipeline and associated tanker traffic is comprehensive and devastating. So there's a lot of Indigenous nations that have a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot of people who just need to be supported. Unfortunately, the government in Canada is prioritizing pipelines over people, but that's what we're trying to change.
So in response to the Superfund site question, there has been some progress, but not a lot. Of course, the U.S. has a reputation in the Pacific for kind of passing the buck on its cleanup of Superfund sites. One example of that is the Marshall Islands and a lot of the nuclear waste that they have stored there, like the Iron Dome or the concrete dome in the Marshall Islands cracking and releasing nuclear waste. The U.S. government says that's the responsibility of the Marshallese government, not the U.S. government who put it there in the first place. Similar things going on in Hawaii. Ko'olave is still unfortunately riddled with unexploded ordnance. The U.S. military did a basic cleanup of it when it gave the island back to Hawaiians. The U.S. military did a basic cleanup of it. However, it left quite a bit of unexploded ordnance, which continues to inhibit the rejuvenation and care for the island. So on the island, one of the biggest projects has been building a road that traverses the entirety of the island, circumnavigates it. And one of the constant challenges with that has been avoiding unexploded ordnance areas on that island, just because of how widespread it is. In addition to that, Pohakoloa and Makua Valley are both Superfund sites as well. I also am just linking in the chat a map of all the military occupied areas in Hawaii. Most of them are Superfund sites. A lot of them are. A lot of the inactive but contaminated ones, Superfund sites. As you can see, the main island of Oahu is heavily polluted, unfortunately, by the military. A lot of Superfund sites on this island. And then in regards to the TMT question, TMT stands for the 30-meter telescope, which is the large, massive telescope that is attempting to be built on Mauna Kea, which is the highest mountain in Hawaii. Canada is a partner in that as well. So if you want to help in getting your country to divest in that, I would highly recommend it. If you visit, here, I'll put it in the chat as well. That should take you to our site, pu'uhuluhulu.org, which is basically the site for the Indigenous Protectors of Mauna Kea. And so that will, you can get more information there on how to help stop the 30-meter telescope, especially from Canada. But in terms of the University of Hawaii divesting from TMT, it's very unlikely, unfortunately. They're very committed to the project. It brings them in a lot of money. So the best hope we have of it currently is just getting TMT to go to their alternate site in the Canary Islands, or just go away in general. And basically taking out its partners from underneath. So those partners include not only the University of Hawaii, but the University of California systems. A lot of Canadian universities are a part of this. China, India, and Japan all also take part in this. And currently, I know there's a debate going on in a lot of the Canadian universities over the efficacy of taking part in this, given Canada's supposed commitment to, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and First Nation peoples, and how supporting TMT, which is being built on Indigenous unceded land, is kind of contrary to that supposed policy. And so I know that debate is going on currently, so now is a very good time to make your voice heard on that. But yeah, there have been efforts to get University of Hawaii to pull out, given the fact that a lot of the people that would be impacted by that are either graduates or current students of the university. But yeah, there's a lot of efforts going on with it. Unfortunately, it's a colonial institution run by a lot of colonizers, and so the likelihood of getting the university to pull out is unlikely. The main target is just getting TMT to stop completely.
I would like to add that the Canadian military has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of contaminated sites across this country. You can look at these at the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory. It's an online public database. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this country to clean up contaminated military sites. I would like to encourage participants to get involved in the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace campaigns to cancel Rimpac, and to also stop the Canadian government from buying new fighter jets. We're having a big national day of action this Friday. We would love it if you would stand in front of your Member of Parliament office with a sign that says "Strike for Climate Peace, no fighter jets," and deliver a letter. All of this information is on our Facebook page and also on our website, vowpeace.org. And I would also like to close by saying that anti-militarism and peace need to be included in our climate justice work. It's absolutely crucial if we're going to win for the climate. We also need to win for peace. So thank you very much to the host for inviting me and including the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace on this panel. And I look forward to working with all of you on these important campaigns.
Thank you. And KAWENA, did you have any kind of general closing comments, or are you done? You're good.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at this today, and I appreciate everyone listening about the issues we are facing here in Hawaii, especially the way Canada contributes to Rimpac. Like I said, there's a lot of things you can do. Tamara offered a lot of great options. In addition to that, please sign our petition, follow our work. We're planning a lot of actions as we get closer to Rimpac. So definitely stay tuned to that and how you can help, especially from a participant country. That's going to be extremely important, especially here and influential. So yeah, please write your representatives, please call them, please send letters to your Department of Defense or whatever agency handles defense in your country. And any of those impacts will really help mitigate it here. If any country pulls out of Rimpac, it has a drastic impact on the others who continue to participate. And so the best way to help demilitarize Hawaii and to help stop Rimpac is to stop giving it legitimacy from your own country.
Thank you. A big thank you to all of the speakers, to all of the great questions and participants. As we said before, Climate Convergence will send a follow-up email to everyone that attended today, and also people that weren't able to attend or were drawn by the uncharacteristically beautiful weather outside right now, so that you can find out how to get involved and capture all of the important information. I think what I am left with the most is just a reinforcement of what we began discussing at a Climate Convergence conference about 1 year ago, about the importance of building an international climate justice movement, especially at this time of pandemic. it's really shown us that the actions in one country or in one community can really affect everyone around the world. And this has been happening when it comes to climate crisis for a long time, for decades. People that live in countries where the ocean levels are rising, or countries where Canada ships their garbage, know what it's like to live in climate crisis. But people in the US or Canada have been able to ignore these impacts for too long. And I think that this has continued to really express itself in the way that people in Canada and the US can also don't experience wars or occupations of foreign military forces. The same way that emissions that come from oil that is drawn from the ground here in Canada, if it's burned in other countries, it doesn't count against Canada's emission targets, but yet it pollutes the same air that everyone around the world breathes. And so this, by necessity, the climate justice movement is an international movement. The struggles of people against massive resource extraction projects, whether it's in Standing Rock in the United States and North Dakota, or the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, or here in British Columbia and Wet'suwet'en against the LNG pipeline, are really the same. And they're the same as the struggles against depleted uranium bombs in Afghanistan, Iraq, or all over North Africa and the Middle East. US wars have killed tens of millions of people and completely destroyed environments for thousands of years to come. Depleted uranium is located nearly everywhere that the US military has landed. Here in Canada, the Department of Defense is the largest consumer of fossil fuels and one of the largest landowners, which pollutes the land. At the time of pandemic, we saw Superfund sites or even any sort of environmental regulations immediately relaxed in the favor of so-called health, but really what turned into and what is in favor of lining the pockets of the world's biggest oil and gas corporations who work hand in hand with governments, including the United States and Canada, to keep this system running. That includes wars and occupations, includes the deployment of National Guard and military against protesters in the United States, and that supports itself with legislation such as Bill C-51 here in Canada, which makes it possible for the government of Canada to target protesters as so-called terrorists. I think that all of us who've participated here tonight, everyone on the panel, we understand those links very well, but we have to work more to learn from one another about how to bring the anti-war movement and the climate justice movement together. The pandemic has caused what may be considered a wave of people's understanding of what it might be like to live in a world that is so impacted. But the impacts from climate change and climate destruction will be millions of times bigger. And governments of the US and Canada and capitalist countries around the world have shown that they are completely unprepared, as Tamara said, to deal with any sort of crisis of that magnitude. So we have to begin now to fight for that better world. We have to fight very clearly from today and from what we've discussed here today, more clearer than before. We have to fight for that better world and for the world not to go back to business as usual. And that's what we will do from Climate Convergence here in Vancouver, Canada, together with people across Canada and around the world. I want to encourage people to get involved wherever you are, to support all of the initiatives that were discussed at the webinar here today, to get involved with Climate Convergence, to join us for right now for actions like painting banners and educational events, and really making climate justice a dinner table issue that everyone is discussing. So the information will be posted again in the chat about how to get a hold of Climate Convergence. There is an email, climate convergence604@gmail.com, which will be posted again in the chat, and we'll be having our bi-monthly meetings. The next one will be next Wednesday, and so you'll get an invitation for that. Thank you again for your time. Thank you especially to KAWENA and to Tamara for your time with us here tonight. We will continue working together and really working to save the planet. The question is no longer to save the planet or save humanity. These are the same questions, and these have the same answer. We cannot save humanity without saving the planet, and we can't do that without ending war and giving self-determination to all oppressed nations. So this is a small ending to a discussion that must be ongoing. And again, thank you all. Share the videos and join our next meeting. Climate Convergence meets twice a month, bi-weekly meetings, and our next one is on Tuesday at Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So save that in your calendar, and we'll be sending all the links. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you all soon.